The theory of subjective value is the fundamental building block of economic theory. At the heart of economic analysis, we have the theory of prices. So we explain the causes of prices, we explain the nature of prices, and the consequences of prices, how prices are being used by market participants to coordinate the activities of millions and billions of people, so the division of labor between a great number of human persons. So the theory of prices is the heart of economic analysis, the heart of the theory of the division of labor, of capital theory, of the theory of the market economy, of the theory of entrepreneurship, and so on. The theory of subjective value, in its turn, is the element that we use to explain some of the causes of market prices. So that's what we do in all scientific activity. We're interested in causes and in consequences. In economics, that's what we do as well. Right? We spend time analyzing the consequences of any phenomenon, the nature of that phenomenon, and the causes of the phenomenon. So here we are concerned with some of the causes of market prices, which brings us to the subject of subjective value. I recommend you take a look at these writings, most notably, of course, Karl Menger's Principles of Economics, especially the first 7 chapters. Then Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, The Theory of Capital, also deals with price theory. The best exposition is actually in Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy and State, the very lengthy chapter 1. And there are important elements of the modern theory of subjective value in Ludwig von Mises' writings, most notably in the Theory of Money and Credit, also chapter 1, and then in his 2 books, Epistemological Problems of Economics and Theory and History. So if you want to learn the nuts and bolts of the Austrian theory of price, the best place to start is Murray Rothbard's book, Man, Economy and State. And from there on, I suggest you take a look at the other texts, if you're so inclined. We start then with the phenomenon that we are interested in, namely exchange. So we can define an exchange as a mutual conditional renunciation to property rights to economic goods. And sometimes we renounce to property rights without any mutual condition that is involved. We make a gift and so on. So that would be a unilateral renunciation of property rights to an economic good. In any case, what is important is that we renounce to property rights. The good that is being exchanged is not always physically transferred to some other person. This is most notably the case if we think of real estate, right? We do not really unplug a parcel of land and then hand it over to the other person. We exchange the right to that object. If we buy a car, we do not necessarily, as a rule, but not necessarily, we pick up the car right away. We might also buy some other object. I might buy from here a painting in Russia or some other place and then pick it up later. So, but still, the exchange goes on. I buy this economic good now, so it belongs to me. And what belongs to me is the property right to that good. So we always have here this mutuality condition. I give so that you give, do ut des. So we have this formula that is cherished by lawyers and legal professors. I give so that you give is a characteristic feature of the nature of an exchange. What is being exchanged are economic goods. And an economic good is something that is in a causal relationship with human welfare, okay? And an economic good is invariably something so that is a good and that can be controlled by human beings, right? So the moon is not an economic good according to that definition. The sun is not an economic good according to that condition. A good that is scarce and a good that we know of, right? So we know of the causal connection. Right? So if one of these characteristics is missing, we are not in the presence of an economic good. So what we exchange is an economic good. An economic good, if something that is exchanged, always fulfills these criteria. It is always a good, at least from the subjective point of view of the exchanging parties. It's always scarce. It is always known that there is a causal connection between that good and the welfare of the two parties. And the good can be controlled. Otherwise, there would be no exchange. Right? Otherwise, it is sometimes objectively the condition is lacking that the good can be controlled. For example, the two of us, we could draw a contract and I sell you the sun. Okay, we can do this. We are free to do this. But in legal terms, this contract would be null and void, right? Because the objective condition that the object be controllable is not fulfilled. Right? So you see these considerations lead us in all sorts of complications right away. So I'll step away from this. Right? But I need to highlight as a professor that there are these considerations that already enter the scene here at a quite fundamental level. So we have property rights, I mentioned this. And then the third condition, right? So it must be an economic good, there must be property rights. The third condition that needs to be given for an exchange to take place is to have inversely related subjective values. Okay, the good must be appreciated by the buyer more than by the seller. I want to give an example. So if we exchange an apple for an orange, then the person who sells the apple must cherish the orange more than the apple. And the other way around, the person who sells the orange must cherish the apple more than the orange that he sells. That is, for each of the two partners to the exchange, the good that he acquires has a higher personal value to him than the good that he gives up. And here we have the phenomenon of subjective value. It means that we prefer something over another thing. And that in exchange, these preference relationships are inverse but compatible. So the person buying the apple prefers the apple to the orange that he gives up, and the other way around. The other person prefers the orange to the apple. So in an exchange, we have an agreement on property rights. Right? Both partners agree that each one is the legitimate owner for the purpose of the exchange of the good that is being traded. But we have a disagreement on the personal or subjective value of the goods that are being exchanged. And without such this disagreement, the exchange could not take place. There where people agree on the subjective value of the two objects, an exchange could not take place. So if both persons say, yes, I like apples more than oranges, or this apple I like more than this orange, then the exchange would not take place. Right? And this, of course, holds true for any exchange that we make. If you buy ice cream, you buy a car, and so on and so on. And that explains why it's so difficult to give a car back once you have sold it, right? Or to give something else back once you have bought it, right? Because for the seller, he actually prefers your money to the object that he's sold to you. Right? If you buy a car from the Peugeot family in France, right? So it's a big car maker in France, still held by the family. I mean, how many cars do they need for their personal needs? None, or a few. Let's say it's a big family. Meanwhile, there are a few hundred members, but so they might need a few hundred cars, and they build hundreds of thousands and even millions of cars per year. So they don't need their cars, just like the baker doesn't need his own bread. Right? He wants to have the money. Right? So we have subjective values that already the first description of this phenomenon. We now need to delve a little bit deeper into this. Right? First, by giving a more precise definition, subjective value is the relative importance of one economic good as compared to another economic good for an acting person at a distinct moment in time. Right, so we have various elements that come here into play. Most importantly, right, there is a relation. Right? Subjective value cannot be expressed absolutely. I cannot say, well, the subjective value of this microphone is so and so. I cannot give a figure to express it. Right? It needs to be expressed relative to something else. So it is truly a relationship in which one economic good stands as compared to another good, but a relationship from which point of view? Well, from the point of view of an acting person who has to make a decision about the two of them. A decision that takes place at a distinct moment in time, and usually, therefore, also at a distinct place. Right? All right, so we have these elements. It's a relationship. Right? It always involves, it's relative to another good, it's relative to a distinct person, it's relative to a distinct moment in time. Right? Three relations that come here into play. Then, in economic analysis and actual price theory, we use a variant of subjective value that we call a value scale, which is an ordinal ranking. So this is not really, it does not belong to the nature of subjective value, but it's a way of expressing, of representing, of symbolizing what subjective value is all about. So a value scale is the ordinal ranking of the subjective values of different economic goods. For example, let's say I have different economic goods at my disposition, most notably the way I use my time. So I can use my time attending a class. You can use your time attending this class. You could also spend your time taking a walk. Now it gets a little hot out there, so but still you could take a walk. Or you could sleep at home or at your student residence or in the hotel or wherever, or in a park. So there's some shadowy places here. Right? So all of you, by being in this room, you have demonstrated that you prefer attending this class to the other alternatives that were open to you. So we may represent this by putting these three alternatives in a horizontal order. Right? So I put attending the class on top, right? And then taking the walk would have been my next best alternative, and sleeping at home the third best alternative. Now, please notice that, of course, strictly speaking, what we know is that you attend the class. That's what we see. That's demonstrated through the action. It becomes already much less clear when we talk about the precise ordering of the alternative options, because here we do not really know. I mean, each one of us says, yes, if I had not attended this class, I would have studied at home. I would have given my old mother a telephone call and all these nice things. But truly, you might have spent your time playing video games or doing other such silly things. Right? So we do not know, right? We do not know. But in any case, as long as there are alternatives, we know, well, there must be a second best, there must be a third best, and so on. But we, of course, we cannot prove them. So we've learned already various things about subjective value, about the nature of subjective value. And we've also learned something about its basic cause. It's the cause that Ludwig von Mises emphasized, namely the cause of subjective value is always the choice made, or a choice made by human beings. So that's the most fundamental thing that we can say about subjective value. Value reflects the choices that we make. Now, there are various economic laws that pertain to the causes of subjective value that we can articulate to a particular class of goods, namely homogeneous goods. Okay. And these are especially important for a great number of economic laws, especially in price theory, but also elsewhere. So we have homogeneous goods. Now, it needs to be said right from the outset that, strictly speaking, in physical terms, it's very difficult to define such a thing as a homogeneous good, right? Even if you think of something like wheat or oil and so on. There are always very tiny differences between distinct concrete units of that good, and sometimes even difficult in the case of oil or other liquids to define what the unit should be. Right? So this is certainly the case. That is, if we try to define what homogeneous good is in terms of physical terms, we might have difficulties. And we might end up in something saying like, well, this is an ideal conception or something of this sort, something that facilitates our thinking about this kind of object. Now, as far as economics is concerned, we're not really all too much troubled with these kind of difficulties, because what counts for us is human behaviors, is the choices of human beings and the way human beings approach their environment. So from the point of view of human beings, we know that certain goods are considered to fall within the same class. That is, from the subjective point of view of the acting person, they are considered to be homogeneous. And that's all that counts for us. So even though there might be differences between this and that car, or this and that sack of wheat, and this and that, whatever, pair of shoes, if the acting person considers them to be homogeneous from the point of view of the activity that is being considered, well, that's then a homogeneous good. Okay. Now, from that point of view, a great many goods are homogeneous, or could at least potentially be homogeneous. So it's a theory that applies to a wide variety of phenomena. Now we have here a first law that pertains to the subjective value of homogeneous goods, namely that a larger stock of such a good is always preferred to a smaller stock. So for example, we have, if we take one of my favorite examples, apples. I like apples. It's very healthy. Much more vitamin C, by the way, than in oranges. Okay, just to say this as a side. And the place where I live in France is a big apple producer. We export them also to Russia and other places. That is, in recent months, the exports to Russia have a little bit declined. So it's good for the local producers. Well, so you take any homogeneous good. For an homogeneous good, a higher quantity is always more valuable for each person than a smaller quantity. Now, this is remarkable, and this needs one explanation, namely that, of course, we can imagine that we come to a point, well, if you have millions of apples and something, how can I possibly eat, even in my lifespan, millions of apples? So why should this be better than having just the amount that I need for my life? So that's correct, right? But then the important thing is that this only pertains to economic goods. Right? So the good character of any object is not independent of its quantity. Right? It can become a nuisance if it is too much. Right? So then it would be an economic bad. Right? But as long as it is a good, this relationship always holds. A higher quantity is more valuable than a lower quantity. Now that's very interesting because although we are talking about something that is involved with choice or rooted in choice, we might think that, well, choice we are completely free, right? We can prefer a smaller quantity to a higher one and so on. No, we are not. As long as it is an economic good, we always prefer the higher quantity to the smaller one. Right? And if we sometimes, of course, we could say, well, give me, 99 apples, I'll give you 101 in exchange. I'm free to do that, of course, right? But then, of course, the point what I actually would demonstrate is only that I prefer to give a counterexample to this law, right? And it's not really a refutation of this logical point that a higher quantity is always preferred to a smaller one, always has a higher subjective value. Then there's a second very important law, and I'll spend the rest of my time essentially on this one because there are other variants. According to this law, each unit of a larger stock has a lower value than each unit of a smaller stock. And this is sometimes said, also expressed in the way that we say that each unit of a larger stock has a lower marginal value than each unit of a smaller stock. All right, so this is then the law of diminishing marginal value, one of the most fundamental laws in economic analysis. To give you an example, that Böhm-Bawerk has used, if I have 5 sacks of wheat, right, and then I think of what will I do with the 5 sacks of wheat, so I will use one of them to bake bread and feed my family, and then I have another sack that I will use to make cake, also for my family. I have a third one that, being a good German, that I will use to distill some alcoholic beverage. Okay, that will I also consume myself. And I have a fourth sack, which I will use to make bread for friends and relatives and so on. And a fifth sack that I will use for charitable purposes, because I try to be a good Christian. Okay. Right? Now, what happens if one of those sacks disappears? Now, clearly then, let's say it's the sack that I had earmarked for bread making for my family, which would for me be the most important use. So subjectively speaking, that's the highest valued use that I would have made of the sack. Now, does this mean if that sack is being eaten by the rats, does it mean that I would renounce to that use? Of course not, right? Because I have 4 homogeneous units that I could also apply to this use. So I would take, in fact, what I would do is to renounce of that use that I cherish least, or that for me, subjectively speaking, is least important. So let's say it's making cakes for neighbors and so on. Okay, so then that use would disappear, but I would still be able to pursue the other projects. Okay. So the value of the sack that was eaten by the rat corresponds to the least important use that I would have made of it. Okay. Now that is therefore we say, well, each unit of a smaller stock has a higher marginal value than each unit of the larger stock. Right? So before I had 5 sacks, each sack had the value that corresponded to the least important use that I could make out of it. And each sack had the value that corresponded to the cake making for neighbors. Now, if I take one of those sacks away, because it's been eaten by the rats, right, so that I have 4 sacks left, now the value of each of those sacks corresponds to the least important use that I can make out of 4. So let's say the least important out of the 4 is the spirits making, so the drink making. Oh, I'm shedding tears. Okay, but let's say I try to be rational, so this is what I do, right? So then, right, each of these 4 sacks would have the value that corresponds to that use. Right? So the smaller is the total size, the total stock that I have, the more important becomes each one of the units that remains. And the other way around, if I acquire additional sacks, for example, because, well, I labor and so I obtain additional wheat, or if somebody gives me an additional sack and so on, then with each additional sack, I can realize projects that were inaccessible before, right, but which are less important than those projects that I would have pursued with a smaller number of sacks. Right? If somebody gives me 2 extra sacks, I can now do things that would have been unable to do with the first 5 sacks. So, but these things, so I kept them in my mind, but I didn't think too much of it because anyway, I just had 5 sacks. But now I have a 6th sack and a 7th one, so I can realize those projects that before were inaccessible and become now realizable. But these projects being less important than the first 5, right? It means that the 6th stack will have a lower value than, or more precisely, each sack out of a stock of 6 will have a lower value than each sack out of a stock of 5. Okay. Now let me just insist that again I just stated the law in the wrong way. Said that the 6th stack has a lower value than the 5th stack, and that would not be correct. As a way you find very frequently in the literature. In the sloppy literature, okay, the world is full of this. Right? So that would not be correct. It's not that the 6th stack has a lower value than the 5 preceding ones. It's that each unit in a stock out of 6 has a lower value than each sack in a stock out of 5. Right? Each unit in a homogeneous stock has the same value. Right? So it's as the stock increases, then each unit has a lower value than each unit in the stock of the smaller size. So if we give an example now again with apples, right, an increase of a stock, well, it means so that each additional unit will have a lower value than the previous additional units that are received, right? So the first additional apple that I receive will necessarily have a higher marginal value than the second additional apple that I receive, and the third additional apple that I receive. Right? Because the first apple increases the size of the total stock from, let's say, from 5 to 6. The second apple that I receive increases the size from 6 to 7, and the third from 7 to 8, and so on and so on. So with each additional apple, right, the stock increases, so more projects become accessible, but these additional projects are of a lower subjective value as compared to the projects that I would have realized with a smaller stock. So therefore, the marginal value of each unit of the higher stock, right, diminishes. So we can say the first additional apple is necessarily of a higher subjective value than the second additional apple received, and the third, and so on. Right? So this is an interesting result. We can turn this the other way around, right? We can now consider the reduction of a stock. Here it's the opposite, right? The third apple gone necessarily has a higher subjective value than the second apple gone and then the first apple gone. Right? If I've initially a stock of 5, is 1 apple gone, okay, so I still have a stock of 4, I can realize the 4 most important projects. If 3 apples are gone, I can only realize 2 projects. And these 2 projects are necessarily of a higher subjective value for me than the 5th one that I would have realized with a stock of 5. Right? So the third apple gone must have a higher value than the second apple gone, than the first apple gone. Right? And then, of course, the 4th one would have a higher value, the 5th one would have an even higher value, and so on. Right? So we get these orderings that are a logical consequence of the very nature of an economic good. We can also articulate these 2 aspects in one common value scale, right? So the third apple gone is a higher value than the second apple gone, than the first apple gone, which in its turn must have a higher value than the first apple received, must have a higher value than the second apple received, and the third apple received, and so on. Right? So we can create or reconstruct this value scale, this general value scale, as it pertains to one homogeneous good. So we move on to the next thing, which is the creation of composite value scales. Right? The same thing that we did here for one good, we can do by integrating several goods, several homogeneous goods in particular. So let's say we have here a very primitive market. There's no money, right? So we have somebody or persons who are exchanging chicken for apples. Right? So the chicken-apple market. It's not likely that this has ever existed in the history in economic history, but it doesn't matter, right? So we imagine something in which there's no money. Right. So we have here a pure seller of chicken. So he owns chicken and he wishes to acquire apples. Now let's say he has the following value scale. And what is important for us is not this concrete value scale, but just to get a feeling how this would look like. Right? So we have here a value scale expressed in terms of apples per chicken that he receives. And here, so the first law that we discussed comes into play, right? A higher quantity received, or higher quantity is always preferred to a lower quantity. Right? So 100 apples per chicken is always better than 99, is always better than 98, and so on per chicken. Okay. Now, I put those quantities in brackets, taking over the writing convention proposed by Rothbard. I put this into brackets to signify that he does not own apples, he wishes to acquire apples. Okay. And he sells chicken, so he's a chicken owner, and let's say he has four chicken, or at least 4 chicken, right? Then the first chicken that he sells is necessarily of least value for him because it would still leave him with a relatively high stock, right? And the more chicken he sells, well, the smaller is the number of projects that he himself can realize with the chicken. That is, as he sells more chicken, then right, each chicken becomes more valuable, right? The marginal value rises. Now we can express this relative to apples, right? So the first chicken he would sell in exchange for 91 apples because in his subjective judgment they are more important than the chicken that he sells. He would not sell it for 90 apples, right? The ranking of the 90 apples is lower. Right. A second chicken he would sell for 92 apples, a third he would sell for 95 apples per chicken, and a fourth he would sell for 100 apples per chicken. Okay. There's nothing really complicated. It's just an integration of the two things that we discussed before, with the further complication that there are now two goods that are involved. Right? So we can translate exactly here the same value scale, right? So this is the same value scale as on the previous slide, and we can translate this into a graphical expression. Now it's not, I didn't plug in exactly the quantities and the prices, then it would look somewhat different, but just the tendency, right? So we obtain this tendency that the higher the price, the greater is the quantity supplied to the market. Right? So we have a positive relationship between the quantity supplied to the market and the price that the seller can expect. Okay, and which is of course the familiar curve that we know from economic studies. You see that at some point this curve must become vertical because you cannot sell more than you have. Right? For some people try to sell us more than they have, but that's a different story. Okay, same thing from the point of view of a buyer. Right, for the buyer, it's the other way around. So he owns apples, okay, and he wishes to buy chicken. The first chicken for him has the highest subjective value, right? Both as compared to the other chicken that he might buy, but also as compared to other economic goods that he might acquire, right? So the first chicken he buys, he would be ready to buy at the highest price. He would be ready to pay 97 apples for that chicken, not 98. Right? Then the 98 would have a higher value for him than the chicken, but he would pay 97. And for the second, he would pay 92 apples, and for the third, he would pay 90 apples, and so on. Right? So we get again a demand schedule. Right? The tendency that we see here is that as the price declines, the quantity demanded on that market increases. Right? And this is what we express with this curve. Right? We have this negative relationship between the price on the one hand and the quantity demanded on the market. Right? So this is how Austrian economists reconstruct demand and supply curves. Right? So it involves no element of psychology that you would find in, let's say, more mainstream texts of a neoclassical bent. There often you have some psychological underpinning. And this works a little bit in the case of demand curves. It doesn't work well, but it works at least a little bit when they say, yes, the first chicken is this is wonderful, it smells good and it tastes great and I'm very hungry and so on. The second chicken, I'm already much less hungry and so on. And then the third one is even worse and eventually I get fed up with chicken and so there's no more value at all, right? So, okay, that's okay, right? In many cases that works, but it doesn't work in all cases. Certainly this would not be a universal law, right? So sometimes you need to eat a first unit in order to develop a little appetite. I didn't know chicken before, but wow, this is not bad. Eat the first chicken, great. And the second one, yes, and there were nuances that I didn't realize before, so my appetite even increases if I can stomach them, right? And sometimes the appetite increases even though you cannot stomach them, right? So this is a different thing. I will not go into the history of culinary arts to make my point, but believe me, right, this psychological foundation does not always work. Right? But the praxeological foundation that I've presented to you, this is a universal. It's always the case, right, that a greater number of units allows us to pursue additional projects, and these projects, by definition, must be less important to us than the projects that we would have pursued with a smaller number of units. Right? So this is a rock bottom explanation, derivation of a demand curve. Now, we can bring these two perspectives together, the perspective of the seller and of the buyer, and see that there is a possible agreement between those two sides that is maximizing the size of the market, which is here in the case of two chickens exchanged on the market. And so certainly these two persons might exchange just one chicken, or the buyer might just buy one chicken, okay, but it's also possible to buy a second chicken with mutual benefit, right? The person who wants to buy the second chicken, he's ready to pay 92 apples for each of the two chicken, okay? And the person who wants to sell 2 chicken, well, he wants to have at least 91 apples for each of, he wants to at least have 92 apples for each of the 2 chicken. Right? So at that price, he is ready to sell a first chicken and a second chicken. Right? And the buyer would be ready to pay for 2 chicken at that price. Right? The first one, he would actually pay more, but certainly pays also 92 for the second. Right? So in that case, then, it's possible to exchange 2 chicken with mutual benefits for the seller and for the buyer. It would not be possible to exchange 3 chicken because you see the buyer, he would only give 90 apples in exchange, and the seller, he would require to have at least 95. So they could not, with mutual benefit, exchange 3 chicken, but they could exchange 2. So we can express this in this usual form, right? It's the point where the 2 curves intersect, right? So graphically, so we have here the price, 92 apples per chicken, and the market quantity would be 2 chicken, right? So that's how you do it. Okay, so we can summarize our findings in 3 main points. Right? We've seen that subjective value is a relation. It's not a substance. It's not something that is inherent in a good. It's a relationship in which an economic good stands relative to some other economic good, relative to some person who has to decide between the 2 goods, and relative to a certain specific point in time. Okay. Second, subjective value has some universal causes. As we've seen, it depends on the expected size of the stock, of the good. I plugged in here the word expected. Right? This is another complication, right? Because sometimes the time dimension plays a role. And for example, if you plan how you will use the wheat that you are right now planting, you know you will harvest the wheat in August or in September. Right? So you're making plans of how to allocate it, and you can only do this once you have a rough idea of how much wheat will be at your disposition. Right? So it's the expected amount that is relevant here. So the subjective value of a homogeneous good depends on the size of the stock. Homogeneous good, I repeat again, right? What is homogeneous depends on the point of view of the acting person. So what is homogeneous for one person does not need to be homogeneous for another person. It cannot be defined in all cases in physical terms. And if you look hard in physical terms, there is no such thing as a homogeneous something. And then we have the law of diminishing marginal value, right? So there is an inverse relationship between the subjective value of any good and the size of the stock. Right? The larger is the stock, the smaller is the subjective value of each unit of that stock. And the other way around, the smaller is the stock, the higher is the subjective value of each unit of that stock. Now, so these were the 2 laws that I was concentrating on. There are others that will be brought up in subsequent lectures, and which are actually quite important, especially for the theory of interest and for capital theory. For example, the relationship between what Austrians call higher order goods and lower order goods. Professor Salerno talked about this, right? So if here in Austrian theory, a value relationship between the 2, right? Lower order goods are of higher subjective value than higher order goods, right? Because you use higher order goods in order to obtain lower order goods. Right? That is, if you could choose between one and the other, you would rather have directly the lower order good. Right? You would rather directly have the consumer good than having just the spare parts. Right? If somebody gives you all the elements of the microphone, and as an alternative, the microphone already ready-made, well, you prefer the microphone ready-made because it would relieve you of the additional work. Same thing for present and future goods. Right? So according to the theory of time preference, present goods are held to have a higher subjective value than future goods of the same type. And so a present meal is to have a higher value than a future meal of the same sort. A present car is considered to to have a higher subjective value than a future car of the same sort, etc., etc. So this is important again, right? That subjective value is subject to these laws, which is a difficulty if you think that, of course, value in itself springs from choice. Right? In choice, we are free, but still, our freedom, our liberty is not absolute. It's constrained by these laws that we do not usually notice. We wouldn't even notice unless we are specifically trained to see this. And this is what we're doing here. And then finally, subjective value has also contingent causes. Right? So that depends on the specific circumstances of time and place. Right? After all, it's always a human choice that enters here into the picture. My present choice might spring from a variety of considerations. I might have this ice cream, then another one, for a number of considerations that depend on this specific day. Maybe I would usually choose, let's say, a strawberry ice cream, but not today because I already had strawberries for breakfast. So this is a contingent condition. It's something that holds true only for today. Therefore, I make a different choice today. Right? So these factors also come into play. Right? So finally, the only relevant criterion by which we can judge the subjective value is always the effective action that is taking place. So the effective choice that is being made. You are in this room, therefore you demonstrate that you prefer attending this lecture rather than pursuing other activities. And so it is on the market as well. Right? It's very speculative, theoretical, if you wish, sometimes to speculate about the contingent causes that might have come into play, because strictly speaking, we don't know them. That is, we hear the opinion of the person who has acted, and some people are pretty good judges of their own activities, but others are not. They do not know what has prompted them, or they do not want to avow what has really prompted them in this and that condition. But we always see what they have effectively done, and what they have effectively done reveals their number one preference. It's the principle of demonstrated preference, concept that we owe to Murray Rothbard, which he expressed in an article published in 1956, a reconstruction of value and utility, of welfare and utility economics. So you can look this up as well. Well, I hope that you are not deceived. Sometimes after one's choice, one is deceived. You say, oh, I made an error. It's another important concept, right, in the theory of value. I made an error. So I hope you did not make an error in attending this lecture this morning.